The thing about quotes on the internet is you cannot confirm their validity. Abraham Lincoln. In August of 1835, the Sun News in New York published a series of 6 articles entitled Life on the Moon. The writer was penned by the name Dr. Andrew Grant, a fictitious person, and said to be a colleague of famed astronomer Sir John Herschel, a real person. The writer had taken advantage of real events that actually happened with Sir John Herschel when he traveled to Cape Town, South Africa in 1834, where he set up an observatory and introduced a new powerful telescope. The articles went even further to affirm an association with the Edinburgh Journal of Science, which was a legitimate journal that had been defunct for several years. The series made wild claims of the discovery of life on the moon, finding precious amethyst gemstones, beavers walking upright, unicorns, bat people who were building temples, and lush vegetation. The articles were so realistic that media outlets from around the world began to reprint the stories and write reviews. Additionally, a group of researchers from Yale traveled to the news headquarters to see the original Edinburgh research journals. The actual writer of the stories was believed to be a writer at the Sun newspaper by the name of Richard Adam Locke. Locke had convinced himself that his writings were science fiction, even when he saw that people believed what he was writing. Overnight, that small 1-cent newspaper became one of the highest circulating newspapers in the world. But ultimately, in August of 1835, after much fanfare and even greater profit, the newspaper ended the series. However, it was reported that the stories were never retracted and an apology was never issued to the public. In October of 1938, the Mercury Theater Company chose to do a radio adaptation of Orson Welles' science fiction novel, War of the Worlds. This was the golden age of radio where millions of people listened on Sunday evenings. The broadcast was complete with emergency warnings about a large meteorite that had crash landed on a farm in New Jersey and that New York was under attack by Martians. With heat ray guns and 7,000 militia killed, Wells and his team employed realistic sound effects that reinforced the human race was under siege. The resulting hysteria and mass panic saw people trying to escape the city while others were converging on the site where the meteorite had landed. The Federal Communications Commission investigated the event, but would find no wrongdoing since there had been an announcement at the onset of the broadcast that most people simply did not hear. Ultimately, the realistic hoax earned Orson Welles a nod from Hollywood. This is it.
We thought that this was it. Listening to that show, I said we were very impressionable at that age because of Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, and that really made a big impression on us.
One fellow in particular who owned a store took the money from his cash register and loaded his car up with food and took off for the mountains and left his wife and children at home.
New York City was just demolished, and they were coming closer.
All of North Jersey is an inferno, and they are proceeding south.
Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Michelle, and I want to welcome you to another segment of Tab Talks. And tonight I have Tyler Seward with us. Good afternoon, Tyler.
Good afternoon, Dr. Michelle.
So welcome to Tab Talks.
I appreciate that.
Okay, I'm going to tell you what's on my mind today, and that's news and views. And we're talking about truth in the internet, if you can even say those two words in the same sentence. And, there's been some really alarming statistics that I've been reading about truthfulness. And when you actually posted some information about it, that was really alarming. So just so I can set up the audience so they can understand what we're talking about, every day, billions of people are online. And it was interesting that 8 in 10 people are saying that they get their information from a tablet, a desktop, their iPhone, their phones. So that's a large number of people that are actually on the internet. And whether they're being sold something, whether we're just being informed about something, you would think that there would be a lot more controls in terms of the veracity of that information. And what I found is that in 2003, actually, UCLA did a study, and at that time, they actually said that 47.3% of the information that people got on the internet was either unreliable or just plain false. Now, that was in 2003. And then now we see another study in 2022 thinking, okay, maybe we'd have gotten it right and you would have seen that number trending down, but instead it's trending upward. And we're now seeing statistics, and this was from New Delhi, India, saying that, oh no, it's as high as 62% that the information is unreliable. So, my concern now is that we're in the age of shorts. And for anybody in the audience that doesn't know what that is, they're reels, either on YouTube or Facebook or social media, where basically you're getting a sound bite. So you're not even getting full news stories anymore. So when I look at that, you're a software engineer and you developed what you thought was technology to be able to assist in this very problem. But what did you discover, I guess, when you thought you were coming up with a solution to help us? What'd you find?
Oh boy, I found that people are too attached to the lies, that they don't want to hear the truth.
Wow. Well, it's either news or views. And I think we've become a society where people are more concerned about the views. So what motivated you to create this program, and tell us about it? Because I was fascinated that you actually had the audacity to say, I'm going to try to come up with a tool that people can actually use to basically surveillance their own stuff, so they're not posting things that are inaccurate or not informative. So what motivated you to do that?
Well, I mean, disinformation online is a big problem. Everybody online knows about it. Everybody knows that, there's disinformation everywhere. And I've thought about this back and forth, like, it's really important for us to have freedom of speech, because, if our government, limits certain disinformation, then they can limit things that we say against the government. And then, it's this whole downward spiral. But at the same time, while we have freedom of speech, it's important not to abuse that and to post things that we know are false or haven't really researched. So I thought, like, how can we have both? So my idea was, I would use AI. I would search for things on social media statements that I knew were false. It was one particular conspiracy theory that I was targeting. And so what I would do is I would target social media posts about this particular conspiracy theory. And then I would have my AI post underneath it an argument citing scientific papers and logic and reasoning and facts, and refuting that argument. So I thought that this would be a happy medium, because it allows these people to express themselves freely, but there's the AI underneath it arguing against it, so the lies don't spread, right? So people can read the AI and they'll be persuaded, oh yeah, actually the AI is right and this person is not. So I thought that this would be successful and helpful, but it's crazy how people responded. Like, they would make up facts. They would just refute the things that I said by saying they weren't true. I got so much hate from people. People accused my AI of being paid by big corporations or something, or brainwashed or things like that. And I was literally relaying to them facts from scientific papers, and then they would say those papers don't exist, and I'm like, so it was crazy. I thought that I was helping, but I realized that I was not.
The papers didn't exist, even when you said, okay, here's a DOI number, this paper exists, and they just said no.
Yeah, I literally said, so the AI said, hey, there have been many scientific studies on this topic, particularly. Here's one, here's another, here's another. These are links that you can click on and go to and see those scientific studies. And the person responded, there has never been a scientific study on this topic. And I was blown away that people would just say things that are so obviously not true.
So my name is Ewan McAndrew. I work at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm joined by Dr. Martin Poulter from the University of Oxford. And first thing is always open with a quote from Vladimir Putin. So this is about the WikiCite initiative, which is a new initiative. So as you've probably already heard, post-truth is the international word of the year. Emblematic perhaps of a year when objective facts have arguably been less influential than appeals to emotion and personal belief. With over 60 trillion web pages to navigate and terabytes of structured and unstructured data to interpret or misinterpret, arguably, it's never been more difficult to find truth in the numbers. But you can do it. The digital intermediaries that we act as gatekeepers to this knowledge can provide attribution for the facts they're producing in their answer engines. So if you ask Google, what's the UK's GDP, you can click through that link to World Bank figures from where that figure's coming from. They're just not doing it all the time. So if I ask, what's the average lifespan of a goat, a more pressing question, for instance, Google will tell me it's 15 to 18 years, but won't give me any attribution as to where that information came from. How can I know it's verifiable? How can I check? Siri does the same thing. It will give you an answer about how long do greyhounds live. Okay, 11 years, but how do I know that's actually accurate? They're saying it's from Wolfram Alpha. So if I go to Wolfram Alpha and ask it questions about greyhounds and goats, it completely contradicts Google. Says a goat's 21 years for its lifespan. So where's Wolfram Alpha getting its information from? This list of impressive looking sources at the bottom of the page looks great. The disclaimer at the bottom of the page is less great, and you have to click in to find this disclaimer. Requests for researchers for detailed information on the sources can be directed here. Requests will be handled on the basis of priority, importance, and available resources.
So if I were going to spread a lie, I would pick a topic that most people know very little about. I would pick something like maybe math, like really complicated math, or maybe physics or electronics. And then I would think of a lie that makes sense intuitively for people who know nothing about that subject. So I would say, like there are electronics in your bread, and you know that because when you wave a magnet over your bread, like it sounds different or something like that. I don't know. I would make up something that sounds like it makes sense, and then people would do it and they'd be like, oh my gosh, he's right. You know, and anybody who knows anything about electronics knows that you can't make electronics that small. Like, where's the battery going to go? I mean, so I mean that's kind of a bad example I just made up, but I would try to make up a lie that sounds like it makes sense, because for a lot of people that's enough. I've had people just say the dumbest things to me about like computers or AI or medicine, and I'll be like, that is not true at all. Why did you think that? And it's just because it sounded reasonable to people who have no experience.
Well, that's interesting. You're right, because I think people can kind of compare or put things together that kind of are true, two different things that are true, but they're not necessarily true together. And one example, as you mentioned that, I remember when the COVID vaccines were being given, And there's also technology that puts computer chips in people.
Oh yeah.
So you started reading this stuff that, well, you know, when they give you the COVID shot, they're going to put a computer chip in you. And people actually believed that because you do have that technology. They were given shots and they were saying that's just going to be a mass way for us to put computer chips in people. And I just thought, where did you find that? And when you ask people, where did you find that? Show me an article. You may find one internet article, but I'm like, there are billions of articles. Who was that person? Where did they find it? But I don't think people want to take the time to really research because they assume the internet is the research. It gave me what I needed. And so it must be true if it's on the internet.
You're right. I mean, and there are ways to come across as credible, even if you're not. There are ways to come across like looking like you did your research, even though you haven't. And I think what you just said is a perfect example of what I was talking about. Like anybody who's into electronic engineering would know that you cannot make a chip small enough to be injected by a needle and then have that chip track you, because I mean, batteries are huge. How would you get power? And, you know, I work with electronics and like the smallest thing I have is like about the size of my thumb, and you can't really go smaller than that, at least for like these microcomputers. And I mean, even aside from that, 99% of people carry one of these next to them at all hours of the day. The government doesn't need to inject you. They can track you with this. So it's just there are a lot of holes in that theory, but it makes sense if you don't know anything about electronics. The government wants to know where I am, and they're giving me vaccine, so they must be putting electronics in the vaccine.
When it's already in the phone.
Yeah.
That you probably got in your pocket. Good example. Okay, yeah, you know, we heard the term fake news over the last 4 or 5 years. That's become a really big term. Well, in Russia, they've actually criminalized fake news, that you can actually go to jail, prison. In fact, in Russia, I believe there's a teen right now. I believe she's being held because of negative views she said about the war in Ukraine, negative views about Putin. And they're saying she's potentially looking at 10 years in prison just for expressing views that were not aligned with the government. So what would you say you could do to help content creators kind of avoid these pitfalls?
Well, I mean, the easiest thing to do is just know your stuff, research things before you put it out there. For example, I follow fitness influencers. And there was this one fitness influencer who posted a video of another influencer. This guy said, you burn more fat when walking than when running. And then this other guy said, no, that's not true at all. You burn more fat when running than when walking. But neither one of them cited any resources. It was just one guy's word against the other. So, I mean, you can rely on what people say to you, like, you know, maybe your neighbor's next door brother's sister said that, you know, walking burns more calories than running, but you don't really know unless you've relied on the facts, unless you've relied on the relevant research. So, yeah.
Well, you know, they have done some research, and I know I found that there were some interesting articles that, you know, Elon Musk was pretty instrumental, I guess, in trying to find out just how accurate the actual database was at Twitter before he purchased it. And I guess when they were doing some of their analytics, they found that there were actually campaigns that were concocted, I guess, during 2016, that governments were actually putting out information to interfere with our elections. So I think with the advent of these bots and these fake accounts, what are people doing to really review this content? Because I found it fascinating that there are people who have time to set up all these accounts. I can't keep up with the accounts that I'm supposed to have, but there are people that are actually setting up these accounts. So it's really hard to track them to a person, isn't it?
It is. Actually, I've met people who do this. What they do is they somehow get control of like 20,000 Twitter accounts. You know, they make 20,000 Twitter accounts. And then they say that I'll get my bot army to do stuff for you. Like I've had people approach me and say, hey, if you pay me, you know, $100, I will have my bot army like all of your posts and have them all follow you. So, yeah, I mean, they're just smart people who know how to do things. It isn't, you know, I don't consider it ethical, but people do it.
Wow. Okay, so you could actually think you've got all these views and they're just empty accounts that like you, and you really think you got 20,000 followers and 19,000 of them could be bots.
Well, I mean, they wouldn't do that unless you paid them, or maybe your brother pays them or something. But yeah, usually you would probably know.
Because if people say, well, how can you find if things are truthful? Well, you could do your own research. You could go to Google Scholar and look up some peer-reviewed journals. You could find some information. Or you go like Snopes or PolitiFact, factchecking.org. There's so many organizations now where you can find things. What do you think about those type of organizations?
Well, I haven't really used them very often. I think they're doing good in the world, because it can be really difficult to find out what the truth is, because what I do is I subscribe to a lot of different news outlets. Like I listen to India Today, BBC, Turkish news, Fox, and CNN, because you can't get the whole picture from looking at just one of them. Everybody has a different spin, and the truth is kind of in between. So I think that Snopes and PolitiFact exist to kind of, challenge the idea that somebody can say a lie confidently and then it becomes truth,
A colleague of mine that's a journalist, we were talking about the caliber of reporting right now, because you see so many retractions and things in the news now. And he said, it's really not about getting it right. It's about being first. What do you say about that?
Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on news outlets right now, because I don't think people have any loyalty to one particular brand. Like maybe in the 1950s, there were a couple of competing newspapers, and you might say, I really like the Times. They're the one that I'm going to go with. And if they got an article wrong, then that would be a huge scandal and everybody might try the other newspaper. But now you just do a Google search for something and you click on the first link you see. It doesn't really matter, which news outlet it is. So I think that a lot of news outlets are under pressure to deliver more content faster, and maybe they might not be able to take the time to discover whether it's true or not. But I think it's still, really, really important. It's much better to, wait and be late than to put something out there and deceive all these people.
From your perspective, why is this work important? What would happen if we didn't have people like you in the world?
I'm going to object to the phrasing of people like me, because fact checking used to be part and parcel with journalism 101, and I don't mean that as a knock. I mean that from experience, because a lot of times what you'll see is when news websites, when news operations scuttle their editorial staff, scuttle their copy editing staff in the name of quote-unquote generating profit, that deteriorates news as a medium, as an industry. What I like about my job is that I actually have the resources to spend days or even weeks on a story, contacting whoever I need to contact. Whereas for other outlets, you're asked to put out, 5 stories per day. Like you were back in the Hearst era. And that kind of news gathering, you lose stuff, you lose details. That will happen. And that damage can be exponentially increased through syndication, through aggregation. There's a story I want to get to that kind of exemplifies that. And so I think what I do is back to basic stuff. And the reason why that's getting lost isn't so much the fault of the talent, it's the fault of the economic forces that come in and try to, in their eyes, reverse engineer a solution to a perceived problem. And in the process, they cause more damage.
Do you think that news outlets have a responsibility to retract bad news?
Oh yeah, I would definitely say that. I mean, like, I feel that, you know, they're trying to make money in a very difficult, very competitive industry. Sometimes there are more important things than making money. You know, I mean, if I put out an article that I later learned was false, I would be super embarrassed. I would be ashamed. I would really not want to retract it. I would be like really, really not wanting to do it, but I would do it, you know?
Case in point, in June of 1897, there were reports coming out of New York that Mark Twain was dying of poverty in London. And of course, Mark Twain himself had to clear up the news story by telling people it was fake.
Well, you know, on Tap Talks, I always give my guests the last word, and you are just phenomenal in what you do.
Thank you,
And
Dr.
I do have to, you know, there's one thing you did share with me, which I find interesting. You said you post daily. How do you keep that rigor or that standard of making sure that what you're posting, because you're posting a lot, and maybe that could be some advice for some people out there. If you're one of those content producers and you're producing content every day, how do you make sure you keep that stuff accurate?
That's a really good question. So, I only post things that I know stuff about. Like, I will post about something I learned about AI or where I think AI is headed. Or if I have advice to give, I will never ever give advice because I find it to be really, really annoying when people do that on LinkedIn. So I'll just tell a story. And if people want to learn from that story, that's great. But I will never directly say, you should do this, because I think that's so obnoxious. But yeah, I mean, there are times when, yeah, I just know what I'm talking about. Do a lot of research before you post something. I think I was reading Proverbs earlier this week, and it totally reminded me of some social media influencers. It said, a fool doesn't want to learn anything. He just wants to express his opinion. And it made me think of some influencers who don't ever learn anything, but they just talk, you know? So it's important to me to always be learning and then share what I learned with people online.
Well, I'm going to give you the last word. You know, what parting thoughts do you have?
I would say, oh my gosh, people, please rely on credible resources only. Do not go to a blog that says like something truth.com. Look at Google Scholar, look at the research papers, ask an expert in that area if, you know, this conspiracy theory you heard is true or false. Like somebody who works as an electronics technician or a doctor or a chemist or somebody who has expertise in that area who went to school for it.
Wonderful. Well, Tyler, you know, you're holding it down on the West Coast. I would thank you for joining us on Tap Talks. You're just always amazing. And people, you know, check out Tyler's posts on LinkedIn. If you want to, you know, keep up with AI and what's happening, he gives you some of the latest up-to-date things, and it's pretty cool. Take care of yourself, and thanks for coming on Tap Talks, Tyler.
All right, thank you, Dr. Michelle. This was really fun. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, bye-bye.